Coming up on this week's show, how to live in 1998 forever.
How the SNES almost got a Back to the Future RPG.
And we talk making chart hits on the Amiga with DJ Aphrodite.
The Retro Hour podcast is brought to you each week with our incredible friends at Bitmap Books. And if you're an old school fan of the Game Boy, or maybe just discovering this monochrome wonder for the first time, check out Game Boy The Box Art Collection, their incredible new book, which is available right now from bitmapbooks.co.uk. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 259, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And a very warm welcome to this week's packed show, as we've got so much to get through over the next hour-ish. I'm actually hoping that you guys can't hear the wheelie bins blowing around outside my window at the moment, as we're getting battered by a storm here in the UK right now, aren't we?
Oh yeah, I came out and there was a tile that had fallen off my roof the other day, and I was like, oh god, that's not a good sign. So it is getting windy.
You know what? I've been cooped up at home, working from home, and when I'm off, I'm just looking after my baby. I don't even know when I last left the house. I didn't even know it had been windy.
Well, hopefully none of our ceilings will blow off during the recording this week, so fingers crossed. However, someone who's definitely going to raise the roof, no pun intended, is this week's special guest, as we're going to be joined by, I know you always love the music episodes, especially Ravi. When we talk about Amiga music, now we've got a legend on the show, particularly if you're a fan of old school jungle and drum and bass.
Yeah, let's keep with the puns. He's probably going to blow your bass bins. And this is DJ Aphrodite, and he was part of the Urban Shakedown Collective, which were like a hardcore group that basically went into the charts. But DJ Aphrodite as well, he was a bit of a programmer. So this is a really interesting interview. We're going to talk about how he was using a PDP back in the days, North Star Horizon. He was doing some really early programming. His dad was a computer professor. Right. So he actually got into programming, and that got him into university, and he was on a course with a guy who created his own computer system, his own language. So no one knew how to kind of use this computer system. No one knew about his programming. And he said, there was a lot of really intelligent people on his course. And what happened was he ended up going into music and the kind of rave breakbeat scene. And he said the Amiga was an absolute perfect machine. So we're going to talk about why it was so good, the kind of bass frequencies, how you could get to those low tones, but also how he managed to actually get to chart success with Urban Shakedown and their Amiga tune. It was Some Justice. Do you remember that tune?
Yeah, because I had friends at school who, a lot of us at school had like Amigas and, Mega Drives, and there's like a crew of us who were into video games, but also this kind of the cooler kids who were more into collecting the, the rave tape packs. Yeah, and they had turntables and all that early on. And I remember then telling one of the kids at school who wasn't into computers or anything, and he always kind of took the mickey a bit like, oh, you guys are geeks. But he's really into his drum and bass and rave music. And I remember Aphrodite actually being on the cover of Amiga Format magazine and actually telling this kid at school, that music's all made on the computer I've got, the Amiga. He's like, no, it's not. He didn't believe it. Flat out didn't believe it at all.
You make it on a trumpet.
well, he did drum and bass and jungle and the kind of breakbeaty stuff. And he was actually with another load of producers as well. So Mickey Finn as well was a big drum and bass one. And he was telling me how, he'd sit there and Mickey Finn would go, oh, can you do this? And he'd kind of be the technical guy doing the bass lines, working with the trackers and all of this, and trying to get those samples sounding really cool and really clear. To the point that actually Urban Shakedown did a sample pack for the Amiga. That's how dedicated they were to the machine.
Yeah, and I love that because, back in the day, a lot of people used those, the standard Pro Tracker. I think they were like sound tracker discs, actually, weren't they? And a lot of mods had that.
ST01.
That was it.
ST00. And they kept expanding them. So it started as like sound tracker 00, and then it got to sound tracker 99. So there were like 99 discs, and the samples got crazier. And they were all stolen, weren't they? They were all like not legitimate.
Yeah, copyright didn't exist back then, I don't think. But yeah, this is going to be really interesting. If you're a fan of drum and bass and jungle music, or just making music on, machines like the Amiga and programming, it's going to be a really interesting chat. DJ Aphrodite is coming up on the Retro Hour podcast in around 20 minutes from now. Now, let's get straight into the stories this week, because we are recording this on Wednesday afternoon, the 20th of January. And actually today is a pretty good day to be recording a podcast, as it is, amazingly, the 20th birthday of this glorious medium. The first ever podcast was recorded on January the 20th, 2001.
That's mental, because, a lot of people say, oh, podcasting, it's a new phenomenon. I can't even say that. It's a new thing. That's it. And they're like, this is really innovative. And people like the BBC are getting on it with the BBC Sounds app and stuff. But it's been here for 20 years.
Interestingly, I was kind of thinking back to when I first started listening to podcasts. I think it was probably around 2005, probably the year. I remember then, I don't know whether Apple just kind of put it into the iTunes app, and maybe that was the first time that it was dead easy just to download them via that. And I was thinking, what were the earliest podcasts I listened to? And I remember listening to, obviously, Ricky Gervais' podcast. Everyone used to listen to that back then before it went behind a paywall. And I think that was kind of the first, podcast that was successfully paid for. I think what was like £1 or something you used to have to pay, I think, at one stage, and he made a fortune off that. I used to also listen to, I don't know if you've heard of a guy called Fevzi Turkalp. He used to call himself the Gadget Detective. He used to do like an early podcast. And obviously This Week in Tech, I've listened to that for years as well. Do you remember, I don't know what it's like for you guys. Do you remember the podcast that kind of got you into the medium?
I think it was actually the Essential Selection, which was like a BBC dance. It was like the big dance show. And then they did like a podcast, or I don't even think it was a podcast. It was just like an online version of the dance show. Like years ago, I used to listen to that. And I think there was a few other kind of ones, but nothing to the level that I listen to now. Like, I'd say 3/4 of the media I consume is podcasts.
Yeah.
To be honest, this is going to sound so bad considering, I've worked on a podcast for the last 5 years, but I barely even knew what a podcast was until we started this, to be perfectly honest.
You still don't, Joe. What are you talking about?
I remember the first... I still bloody don't. The first ever episode I worked on, I was on with you guys. I shared it on my Facebook, and I didn't even call it a podcast. I was like, this blog I helped with. And then I had to go back. I was like, it's not a blog, it's a podcast. Nothing like a blog or anything. So... until you kind of mentioned it just before the show, I'd never really given it much thought, like when the first ever podcast would have been. I literally would have had no idea. I would have assumed it would have been kind of at the boom of the internet, like the turn of the century, and obviously it is. So yeah, and I still don't really listen to any other podcasts. But interestingly, my wife listens to loads of podcasts. She puts them on in the background all the time. She went through a phase when our daughter was first born, and all the way through the start, the first 6 months of lockdown as well, of literally just podcasts on all the time in the car when she's cleaning and stuff like that. She's never listened to us ever.
Don't blame her.
Which, is great for me. But yeah, no, I've never given it much thought, to be honest. But there's, like you say, there's loads out there. You guys listening to them for years, by the sounds of things.
Well, I think, you mentioned that your wife's getting into listening to podcasts recently, and that's quite interesting that it is kind of become a lot more mainstream in recent years. And my missus, who, when I met her and we started, she was the same. She didn't even know what a podcast was. She asked me, how do you listen to it? And the other day she figured out how to get Harry and Meghan's podcast on the Amazon Echo in the kitchen. So it's really mainstream now, obviously. But there's an interesting article on podnews.net, which is a great website all about podcasting. And they talk about how a lot of people reckon that there was a podcast called Open Source in 2003 that was the first real podcast, because that was the first show that was actually recorded specifically for the platform. But you've mentioned this before. It's actually Adam Curry. Ravi, I know you've mentioned him before. He was a former VJ on MTV, a bit of a rock star himself back in the day, but he was really the guy who came up with the idea of putting podcasts on RSS feeds. Now, RSS, he actually worked with a guy called Dave Weiner. And the idea is with RSS, I'm sure a lot of people know, but it was really a feed that could give you up-to-date information. And Adam Curry back in 2001 had the idea, because you think back then, a lot of people were still using dial-up or just kind of cable modems were coming in. But the fact that they were always on meant that even though the speed was slow, you could actually download things on it when you weren't using it. So the idea that he had is, rather than having really low quality audio streams, I remember trying to listen to internet radio.
Oh,
in
yeah,
like
2000,
a
real audio internet radio.
Yeah.
Well,
I used to do an internet radio show in, 1998.
Well, they had a thing called Icecast back then, I remember. That was a way that you could do internet radio and TV onto Winamp.
Yeah. But you remember, when you tried to do that on your old school connection, that's all you could do. If you loaded a web page while you're listening to it, it'd stutter and drop out. So Adam's idea was that, a podcast would use the RSS feed and it would download like overnight while you're not using your computer. Then the audio would be on your hard disk in the morning and you could listen to it. And it's interesting reading this article because Dave, the founder of RSS, he was like, why would anyone want to do that? They didn't really understand, the use case of it. And it took a couple of years until it really caught on. But it's interesting that, like many ideas, people don't really appreciate kind of the potential of them until a good few years later.
And I think, it's really interesting because other formats, like you've got YouTube, right? And you put something up on YouTube, it gets edited, it gets copyright flagged, it gets changed by the actual provider. But the RSS feed, we have inline adverts that appear on it and stuff, but there's no censorship. There's no change. So I think that's really helped podcasts thrive. And also, there's a danger as well because, with something with no censorship, you've got to watch what you're saying as well.
You can still get sued.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword, podcasts.
But interesting, kind of spanning that into online radio, I've been really weirdly binge-watching a load of episodes of the Computer Chronicles again on YouTube. I'm kind of working my way through them all. And I think I'm up to around 1993 on there now. And there's a guy called Carl Malamud who actually started what they reckon is the first internet talk radio station back in 1993. And the website for it is still up. And you can still go back and listen to, interviews that he did with people like Tim Berners-Lee that he did in October 93. These are actually in, it's in AU format, which I think was on the Mac back then. You got real audio.
Oh, there was OG as well and weird formats, weren't there, for the Mac?
The file sizes are really small. This internet radio show is 1.8 megabytes, and I think it's like an hour and a half long. So, the medium's been there for a long time, and actually you could argue, he also made his shows available for download, but the thing about a podcast, it has to be on the RSS feed, I think, for it to qualify as a podcast. But, the fact that 20 years after the idea was first planted, I think, the fact that it's now one of the biggest mediums in the world, long may it continue. Here's to another 20 years of podcasting.
Definitely. And I think with that RSS technology, it is just going to continue how it is, unless someone takes over RSS, but I don't see that happening.
Don't let Spotify buy it. Right, okay. Let's get into some gaming stories now. Now, this is one that I know Joe's going to be really interested in, being a big fan of Zelda, as you revealed on our latest episode of the Retro Hour After Hours podcast, where we talked about our favourite video games of all time. But actually, an early build of Zelda 64 has been discovered on an F-Zero X development cartridge.
Yeah, this is really interesting, and I've got a lot of questions about it, which aren't answered, unfortunately, in the feed. So hopefully we'll get a little bit more information about it over the next coming weeks. But yeah, this is really cool. So a guy known as, or a team known as Forest of Illusion on Twitter have shared this. Now, this is my first question, they've not said where it's come from or anything like that. It's just been found, like you say, on an F-Zero X development kit. But yeah, it's assets of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which weren't essentially used in the final product. So apparently they think this may have been for Space World 97, to show off kind of like a demo. But
that was like a big kind of trade show.
Yeah, it was a big trade show in, I want to say in America, it might have been Japan, I'm pretty sure it was America. But, the Space World 97 video of Ocarina of Time is quite famous anyway, because of it had these, nice shiny graphics that we never saw in the end. That's a different story completely. But this actually looks quite a lot like the final game, what Ocarina of Time ended up looking like. But essentially, they've put it out there. People have already actually got it up and running, which is really cool. Dan, you actually sent me the video of it as well. We've got about 2 minutes of footage of Link running around in Kakariko Village. I've probably said that wrong, but Kakariko Village, which is essentially the second village you go to in the main quest in Ocarina of Time. It looks nothing like what the final town looks like. It's the first village you go to, sorry, but it looks nothing like the final product. Like, the houses are just like normal houses. It's a big open kind of like world, open map, which you didn't see loads of in Ocarina of Time. There's quite a bit of misting in it as well, the draw distance.
Yeah,
it looks like a Microsoft flight simulator level when you get down to the ground.
That's the textures of it. Literally, look, you're just spot on there. I couldn't put my finger on where I'd seen that kind of textures before, but the final product doesn't look like that in the end. Interestingly, they spelled attack with a Q on the button layout as well, which I thought was quite funny. But yeah, it's interesting to see because this has never been seen before. It also states that there's never seen before images on there as well. But it's interesting that they said that because these are all just images which did actually make it into the final game. So the images are actually in the final game, but they've probably been never seen before. They've never seen them in that development state before. But I do think the video is the most interesting thing. There's no sound effects and there's no music on there. It's just the graphics, and that's not just because the guy who's uploaded it onto YouTube has muted it. Apparently, that's how it was found. There's no sound effects or anything in there, but it's really interesting. I'm just like I say, I'm interested to see where this came from and why is it on an F-Zero X cartridge.
Yeah. I think
really
they obviously had this cartridge ready to demo at the show then, and maybe the thought rather than making a few different cartridges, we'll put it all on one if there's room.
Yeah.
But it is cool. I mean, if you look at I'll put a link in the show notes to the article on Nintendo Life where the tweets are embedded. But actually, Forest of Illusion have actually tweeted a few pictures kind of collectively showing all these textures that weren't used in the game. And also there's kind of some leftover graphics, some of which look very different to what was in the final game. And some they've actually pieced together to make it into actual maps. And there are some people, I mean, there is that one level that's playable now. Looking at the comments on here, some people are actually saying that they think in terms of what you can do, it actually looks a bit more free than some of the levels that were eventually in the game.
That's what I was saying. It I probably didn't articulate it very well, but it looks more open than what the final product kind of looked like. Which I think some of Ocarina of Time's charm is that when you're in the towns and the villages, there's a lot going on. For a game that came out in like 1998, they're quite living worlds, if you know what I mean. Like they're quite, there's a lot going on and stuff. Whereas what this footage shows is like just static houses in a row in like a big massive open field, which you never saw in the final product. Link is very much the same, like the way he's playing and his graphics on him and stuff, but the houses, I mean, those houses are used in one of the villages, but the textures are all wrong on them and stuff. It's very odd, it's very strange, but very interesting.
Last week we were talking, obviously we've had a few of these come out. We talked about the Sonic 1 beta last week. And again, I mean, kind of echoing what I said then, I just think that seeing game development in process, especially from like a massive company like Nintendo, seeing the process they went to get a game. And, when you get into this era, I mean, Sonic 1 compared to modern games is very simplistic. Well, this is kind of when you get to the open world kind of era and, games became a lot more complicated then. So I do think it's fascinating to kind of see their journey towards a final game.
Yeah, no, it is really interesting. And, what I always love about it is the fact that people always get it running within this was only tweeted yesterday and somebody's got it dumped it and got it running. Like Ravi's already completed it. But
I've already imported it into Flight Simulator.
He's been playing it on the Wii U. But no, it's crazy.
Well, you can download it as well. I mean, they've put a link in here if you want to download all the assets in the ROM, so you can dismantle it. If you're doing to try and get something else up and running. I love the top comment as well on the Nintendo Life article. I can't wait to watch some shrill-voiced nerd pick apart every detail in a 30-minute YouTube video. I'm not being sarcastic. I'm literally excited for this.
And also, get it whilst you can, folks. It's Nintendo.
Yeah, it's Nintendo. It's probably gone by the time this episode comes out.
Yeah.
Downloading as we speak. Ravi will sort you out with a copy. Now, this is something we've talked about before. and it's something that actually seems to be a bit more mainstream at the moment. We were talking about this yesterday, actually, Ravi, on Facebook, as a couple of friends of ours, Neil from RMC and Peter from Nostalgia Nerd, they were in the Times.
Yeah,
they actually dedicated half a page talking about kind of how retro gaming and retro computing is becoming a lot more valuable now. And there's an article that Joe sent me here. Let me get the website up because it's on a site called Hype Bay, which actually seems to be a girl's fashion and beauty blog website. Not sure why you're reading that, Joe. What you read in your own spare time, it's up to you.
I'm just all about the handbags, mate.
But they've actually done an article talking about how Pokemon trading cards and retro video games are the new way to invest. So again, I mean, it's kind of talking about how, oh, wow, look, suddenly those old video games in your attic are worth a load of money now. And they're giving some of the current prices, stuff like Super Mario Brothers made for the NES, an original unopened version of it, sold for $116,000. And they link through to another website called Raisin that actually kind of gives you a little bit of statistics in there about how much the value of them has gone up over recent years. So, I mean, it's had quite a jump again. I mean, we've been talking about it ever since lockdown here in the UK started. The fact that things like the Wii has had a huge spike in value. And, if you go on eBay now, they're selling for way more than they did a couple of years ago, whether it's because people have got more time and they're bored at home, or it could just be a timing thing. But then I was checking out another website that has popped up recently, because when you see stuff like that, you think, oh, I'd love to own one of those original Super Mario Brothers cartridges, but I haven't got a chance of affording it. Well, there is a website now called Otis, and they allow you to buy essentially shares in collectibles. So if you've got like a crew of you, like say us three guys wanted to put, £20,000 in each, which I'm, with the amount Ravi's Bitcoin's gone up this week. Yeah, I'm sure Ravi's got that in his Bitcoin wallet. But then we could all collectively buy it, which allows people to maybe have a piece of something that otherwise they wouldn't have chance to own.
I'm confused. What are you buying? Are you buying shares in video game companies, or are you buying shares in the trading? I
believe it is essentially like that episode of Simpsons where they buy Radioactive Man #1. Like, we would all put together and we would buy, how, like Dan said.
Oh, okay. So you're you're clubbing together.
Yeah, we're seeing these sealed copies of Mario Brothers go for $1 million. And essentially this website, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not so much about, oh, you're collecting it so you've got it in your collection. It's a case of you all pull together, so you've got it as an investment, and then in 10 years' time you sell it and then you all keep the profits.
It's weird, because if you have something that's rare and then suddenly someone finds like 1,000 versions of it, or like, you've got, oh, I've got the only one in the world, and then, no, you haven't, mate, we've got a whole cupboard here.
That's the interesting thing about rarity. It's a completely different subject, but people are like, oh yeah, that game's a rare game or whatever. But, when it comes to buying, retro video games and stuff like that, but actually it's not rare. Like 10 million copies of it sold. It's just a sought after game. But I guess
sought after, yeah.
But but I guess where it's coming into the rare stuff, inverted commas, is, like Dan said, a sealed copy, the last sealed copy of Mario, or the last sealed copy of, it says World of Warcraft here. Sealed copies of that are now selling for $4,000, which I think is ridiculous.
And also, I think it moves with time as well, because like a lot of the media is dying. Like, if you're selling Commodore 64 tapes, they're going to be so old by now that probably half of them work. I don't know, C64 guys, let me know. But I'd certainly know with CD-ROMs, I'm selling Amiga CD32 ones, and they're getting 20 years old now.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, personally, I think this bubble's going to burst. It says trading cards, Pokemon cards seems to be the massive one this last kind of year. I think it's all going to burst eventually. And I'm not buying anything at the moment. I'm only buying sought after games that I actually want to play for like 20, 30
It's
quid.
like, you look at this and trading cards, they're really high up. Vintage comics are really high up. But if you think about it, they're in the format that has outlasted every other format, which is paper.
Yeah.
Which we still have copies of old Bibles. We still have, really, really old copies of paper stuff where I don't know if kind of PCB is going to last that long.
Yeah, yeah, no,
but Superman #1 is always going to be Superman #1, isn't it?
Well, I think with these, I mean, you mentioned then, Joe, the fact that all of these I'm looking at here are sealed copies. So, I mean, it doesn't really matter if the Super Mario 3 cartridge that you've got for the NES actually works inside the box because you're never going to open it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't get that either. Yeah, that's weird.
There is that as well, but it's interesting. And like I said, I think the bubble's going to burst. People are going to end up being, like, I'm the guy who owns this $1 million copy of Super Mario Bros. 3, but now it's not worth that. Do you know what I mean? Like these things happen, or some things get found,
or disasters happen. Like look at Last Gamer, where he had that huge, beautiful arcade collection. I think it was Last Gamer, and there was that lightning that went on all of his electricity and then went through and fried all the machines.
Fried all the machines, didn't it? But yeah, I mean, just coming back to what you were saying earlier on, people find stuff as well. There was the Virtual Boy. I can't remember what year it was, but a couple of years ago, they found a freight container of like 1,000 of them, which went missing in the 90s, and they found the container with like 1,000 Virtual Boys in, and they just went onto the market straight away.
Yeah.
Well, what do you guys think are the retro gaming investments of the future? I'll tell you what I think, and this is a weird one. I'm probably going to destroy my profit making by telling everyone. But do you remember Microsoft Sidewinder?
I've got one on the table next to me because
yes, mate.
You were talking to me about it yesterday, and I fished it out.
Yeah,
I don't know what that is.
I'm starting to collect Sidewinder stuff because I think really interesting controllers.
Joe doesn't know what they are.
They were basically before the Xbox.
Okay.
Custom like pads that Microsoft did. They also did these big flight sticks, and they look very similar to the Xbox pads. But they're like 12 quid boxed at the moment on eBay. And I guarantee if LGR did a video about Microsoft Sidewinder, then suddenly the whole market would go mental.
And that's the other interesting thing about rarity and sought after stuff. All it takes is a very big YouTuber sometimes to review one of these oddities, and all of a sudden they become big again. I was actually watching a Metal Jesus Rocks video the other day about the Amiga CD32, and he had one of his guests on saying how he's for ages been wanting to get one, and it wasn't until the Angry Video Game Nerd video came out about them that they shot up in price again. And it's just like, it's weird, isn't it? Just how like stuff will shoot up and then go back down. But like you say, Ravi, somebody will do a video on Sidewinder and all of a sudden they'll be worth 50 quid.
Then again, Ravi's quid's in now because he was selling Amiga CD32 games this week, weren't you? So that might be why. So if Jason's listening, you should thank him. Now, let's talk about something that didn't actually make it to market. And this was something else that AVGN covered. I remember he did a video all about Back to the Future games. And they're actually saying in this article here that, most of the games were pretty terrible. I do remember I played it was Back to the Future 3.
For the Mega
I think
Drive.
on the Amiga I played it on.
The
Yeah, which
Amiga
it might be the same version, but it was an awful game. Really difficult. But then there was the one that came out a couple of years ago. I think it was Telltale did it. The
point
talkie
and
adventure game.
click. Yeah,
And I love that. I thought they were brilliant. I had that on the PS3 and the PS4. But there was also a game that came out only in Japan called Super Back to the Future Part 2. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen this before, but it's a platformer game that's kind of in that Japanese cutesy style.
Well, Super Nintendo, doesn't it?
Although it really looks like it's trying so hard to be Sonic.
Yeah, it is a little bit. And you know what? They said that game in this article isn't a very good game either, but I actually really want to get my hands on that. That looks really cool. But yeah, we've not had much luck with retro classic Back to the Future games, have we? Like the only one, like you said, the only good one really is the Telltale's. Is it Telltale's game?
Yeah,
the Telltale's game one. But yeah, this is cool. Apparently, we were gonna get a Back to the Future RPG for the SNES.
Oh, that
around
good.
Around 1992, 1993. Now, this has actually been unearthed by one of our friends. Now, I'm not going to say his name right. I'm going to get you to say it now, Dan.
Well, Frank Cifaldi.
There we go, Frank Cifaldi, because I always say his
covers
surname
everything.
wrong.
Frank's always on it.
Yeah, Frank's always on it. He's unearthed this in a Japanese magazine from 1992. Screenshots of a very Zelda, A Link to the Past looking Back to the Future game, which just, I don't know, we don't know what happened to it or anything like that. But I would have loved that. I would have thought that would have been wicked. From what I understand, you could swap between Marty and Doc, and you go around the city and stuff like that, doing side quests, doing fetch quests and stuff like that. I don't know why this didn't come out and why we got Super Back to the Future 2 instead.
I like that it's got the town hall in there as well with the clock and stuff. It looks like, you get a lot of games that aren't really that related to the actual franchise that it's representing, but this seems to relate really well.
Yeah, and we don't know how far in development this was or anything, but it looks far enough. We've got sprites, like you say, we've got artwork and stuff like that. We've got logos. Of course, we had the logos to film, but yeah, once again, similar to the Zelda story we were just talking about a moment ago. I've got more questions for this. Like, I want to know what happened, where's it gone and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the article, this was in, and I think we've actually mentioned
Famitsu magazine.
For Famitsu magazine before, which was it's like a weekly gaming magazine. And reading this article here, it kind of looks like the same team who made the platformer Super Back to the Future Part 2 were working on this, and they kind of changed their mind midway through development and thought, we'll make it a platformer instead of an RPG. Which, interestingly, apparently, that only came out in Japan anyway. My first thought was whether they were intending to release it in the West. And they thought, around that time, early 90s, platformer games were all especially over here in America, there was the main style of games.
Yeah.
Whether they thought that would be more successful, because RPGs, obviously massive in Japan, but a lot of them haven't really translated to the Western audiences, particularly not back then.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. I think maybe that was their thought processes. They were hoping this would be a worldwide release, would get it in PAL territories and NTSC, but obviously we didn't, and I think you were completely right there. RPGs weren't half as big as what they were now. It was Final Fantasy VII that changed that in like 97, and in 91, 92, I guess releasing an RPG would have been a big gamble, which wasn't Zelda. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, that must have been the reason they changed it. But coincidentally, it only came out in Japan anyway, so they probably would have made more money if they just did the RPG in just Japan.
Well, I look forward to the beta being uncovered on Twitter in the next few weeks.
Exactly.
Now, before we chat to Aphrodite, our special guest this week, have you ever been online and just thought, I miss the old internet? Well, I was checking out the Facebook page of our good mates at the Home Computer Museum in the Netherlands. We know Bart there. We've met him a bunch of times. Lovely guy. And if you're ever in the area, highly worth a visit, when things start to reopen again. But he actually has come up with a way. So if you sit down at any of the computers that are online at the Home Computer Museum and you type in, for example, google.com, it will actually fetch the 1998 version of Google. And any other website that you type in, you essentially are accessing the web as it was in 1998. So if you're on Sega's site, it'd be talking about the Saturn. If you're on Apple's website, they'd be pushing the new iMacs, I imagine, around that time. So they've actually used a proxy service that he's built in-house that goes via archive.org. And archive.org, they have a thing called the Wayback Machine, which I'm sure you're familiar with, where, probably the biggest online archival process that I've ever heard of. They're trying to archive the entire internet. And they've been doing this for I think they go back to around 92, 93 with their archives. So he's actually picked this year and put it in, so everything is served from 1998. But then there is another website that I'm a big fan of called theoldnet.com. And I have this set as my homepage on my Amiga 4000 and my 486, and that allows the websites from archive.org to be viewed using Netscape Navigator from 20 years ago. It works fine on there. But now they've actually made a proxy version of theoldnet.com. So that means you can actually just go into the settings on your browser on your old machine, set it to be the old net.com, and then next to it in the port, you actually put the year that you want the internet to be sent to you from. So if you want to live in like 1998, you set your port as 98. If you want it to be 1996, you can change it to 1996. So then everything that you access on the internet will be served from that year via archive.org.
You should just do that to like all your computers in your house, and then whenever your wife tries to get onto something,
now there's a good idea.
That's a really cool idea, actually, because like navigating Wayback Machine's quite nice, but it's like done on the individual sites. And this kind of old school search engine is wicked. I've just searched for Dan Wood in 1998, and it's a housing company.
I hate those guys. They always
Dan Woodhouse.
They were in there early, mate.
Just don't find any of my embarrassing old Usenet posts.
That's it. But yeah, it goes through all the old search engines as well. So like it searches Angel Fire, GeoCities as well. So I'm trying to see if some of my old sites are on here actually.
Yeah, well, I found a few of mine on there, the links of which I will not be sharing. But I think the fact that you can do it though at the proxy level, if you want to turn your whole house into like a time machine, you could probably do that on your router.
Yeah, no, that would be funny. That would be so funny. Anybody who kind of comes in or something, like imagine if you could do it on their phones as well, and they connect and they're just like, what's going on?
I imagine if you did it on the router, then if they're accessing your Wi-Fi, that probably would work.
Yeah,
that's a good idea. I might make a guest network. Just like a 1996 guest network on my router.
Well, we need to do that on the website as well, don't we? Like 1996 mode.
Yeah, Ravi and I have been talking about that for ages because Ravi's made, if you've been on our website recently, it's all sexy and flashy now. But we were chatting that we should do kind of a GeoCities style version.
Yeah, I don't know if I could bring myself to go back to coding like that again.
I would love that. When anybody asks me about the retro, I'd send them to that site instead.
It doesn't work on the mobile. It's asking me to install Flash.
Says under construction. When's it going to be finished?
Shall I choose frames or no frames?
Oh, God, frames. I remember them. So if you are getting nostalgic hearing us talking about all this stuff, check out theoldnet.com. And if you've got an old computer and you want to permanently put it in the past and access the internet as it was back in the day, check out their new proxy service as well. Right, now, before we get into our chat with Aphrodite, just time to give a big mention to a couple of things. Amiga Addict magazine. Now, we mentioned this before. This is a little disclaimer, the magazine that you are the editor of, Ravi. And I know you're actually getting ready to drop issue number 2.
Yeah, so you got issue 1 through the post, didn't you, Dan?
Yeah, read it over Christmas. Really good, actually. I don't think I've given my thoughts on the podcast of it, but when it landed, 'cause you sent me like a preview PDF and I had a quick skim through it.
And you thought, God, Ravi's involved. This is going to be crap.
I wanted to actually read the paper version because to me, I've got Readly and stuff on my phone, which is great if you haven't got the paper copy of it. But particularly for Amiga magazines, I wanted that experience that I had when Amiga format came through the letterbox, or I picked up, Amiga Shopper and stuff like that, which I've got to say, you guys did a sterling job on it. I mean, I was so impressed with the paper quality, the glossy cover in there, full colour, fantastic articles in there. And actually, I read it over Christmas, so really enjoyed reading it. So I'm already really hyped for issue 2. I know you've got some stuff like Steve Hammond from DMA Design's going to be in there.
Yeah, so issue 2, like issue 1 was very much, we're kind of introducing the magazine, we're introducing people to the scene, and that there is an actual Amiga community in 2020. Now, this one we're looking a bit back at the history as well, but we've gone mental on games. So we've got DMA Designs being interviewed, which is an interview I've done with Mike Daly and Steve Hammond. We've got readers' letters, we're doing demo scene interviews, we've got a whole thing about the CD32 and CD TV as well. And the idea with this one is that we're going to try and offer content that's not on the internet. So having it printed will give you some unique stuff. So like this interview I've done with Mike Daly and Steve Hammond, we take a little different direction there, and we talk about the rumors about GTA being made on the Amiga and where that kind of rooted from, and try and like work out what happened there. And there was a few court cases and stuff, so really interesting stuff there. And It's amazing. It's on sale now, amiga-addict.com, and it's mad that we're doing it monthly. So we're even working on issue 3 at the moment, which might be a bit relevant to today's guest as well.
I look forward to reading it in the bath when it arrives, hopefully next week then.
That's the way to consume magazines, isn't it? In the bath.
Especially with that glossy cover, it's kind of, I was going to say wipe clean, but that sounded really wrong. It doesn't get wet, that's what I mean.
Oh, Amigas.
Depends how much into Amiga you are.
I'm very into the Amiga, as you know. Right, so yeah, definitely check it out if you're a fan. Now, we also have a Patreon running at the moment, and that is for, the cost of running this podcast. Helps us out with everything that, the weekly costs that we have for doing this show week in, week out for you guys, all the hosting and everything, the equipment we need to buy, setting up our home studios over the last year. You've really helped us out with that as well. And of course, you do get our extra bonus patrons only podcast. And we did the impossible, choosing our top 5 favorite video games of all time. I listened back to that the other day, and in my head, I was like, because I couldn't remember what I said. And I think my list in my head was completely different to what I said on the podcast.
Well, next one, we're going to do forcing each other to play titles that we like, which is going to be really interesting because I'm going to pick some really odd ones.
Oh gosh,
and we have to give little reviews, do we then, of each other's favourite games?
Yeah, what you liked and what you didn't like about it, and then we can compare and contrast.
Compare notes.
Yeah,
I'll be like, what do you mean you didn't unlock this?
You only got that far.
Get ready to get your Atari Jaguar emulators installed then, lads.
Oh god.
But of course, for backing us on Patreon, you'll get a mention on a future episode in the Retro Hour Hall of Fame. Like this week, big shout to Joe HD,
Darren Miller,
Andy Ticklebank,
Marcus Davis,
and from V Blank Entertainment, Brian Provinciano.
Thank you so much for your support, guys. It really means a lot to us. And of course, we'll be doing another Patrons Hangout in a couple of weeks' time as well. I think the last one we did was probably our biggest one yet. I think I had about 2 pages worth of people on there.
I couldn't fit them all on the screen. Yeah. I need to get a bigger monitor for the next Hangout.
So we'll be posting a link to that, and of course you sometimes get the podcast early as well and ad-free, loads of perks as well. If you'd like to back us on Patreon, all the details are at theretrohour.com. Right, next we're going to talk about making chart hits with the Amiga, behind the scenes on the old school drum and bass and jungle scene as well. So much in this week's interview with Aphrodite. He is next on the Retro Hour podcast. You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and it's time to welcome on this week's very special guest. And our guest today is actually someone we get a lot of requests for, particularly from our listeners who are really into music production. And I remember actually reading an interview with our guest this week in Amiga Format magazine back in the day and being absolutely amazed at the kind of things he was doing on the Amiga back then. So we'll talk about all that and lots more as well. Let's welcome him on. Gavin King, better known by the name Aphrodite. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me on.
Really appreciate you joining us. And we'll obviously get into all that stuff that you were doing back in the day on the Amiga, because, I had friends that couldn't believe the music you were making was made on like an Amiga 500 back then. But before we do, kind of rewinding to the start of your journey with computers. Do you remember what initially got you into computers and when you first saw one?
My dad was a professor of computer science. As far back as I can remember, we had computer paper in the house, and then I think for my 6th or 7th birthday I was given a white Sinclair handheld thing that I used to program, and then I used to follow him and learn to program at a very early age.
What was that white Sinclair device, and what were you kind of programming? What stuff were you making? Was it just basic copying out of magazines?
No, there weren't really any magazines back then. This is kind of before magazines, before everything. It was like a Sinclair handheld device, and I think it was Lan the Lem, or some sort of Space Invader type game that I programmed in, then changed the variables to make it different, and it was all done in some sort of basic machine code.
Yeah, 'cause I remember doing stuff like that, and when you figured out how you could modify a game and kind of manipulate, the code in the game. That was really satisfying, I think. You felt like a bit of a hacker doing that as a kid, didn't you?
Yeah, that's right. It was a handheld calculator. I've no idea where it is now. I can't even. I've just Googled it. I can't even see one.
Probably go for a fortune on eBay now.
Probably would.
Well, I mean, musically, I mean, you play piano and violin. I mean, having a formal training to read music, I mean, do you think that was a bonus then when you went on to making computer music?
It was, in that I knew how phrasing worked, and I knew cadences, how things should end. I knew about all the kind of like laws of making music, in that you group it in 4s and 8s and 2s and all those kind of things. But what I didn't, but I think the most important thing, one of the most important things that came through from the violin playing was the fact I have perfect pitch. It's a very weird thing that my mum was a pianist, and if I tell you that I do not understand how a pianist manages to read 2 staves at once, it's a mystery to me how they look at a sheet of music and at the same time they can read the left hand and the right hand and they play the music. Yeah. A piano player will ask me how I find the top E, and I tell them that I think about the note in my head and my hands just go to the note and it plays it. And that's how violinists make, that's how we find the notes. We think about it in our mind and our hands just do it. And a pianist doesn't understand that. So where that comes in useful with the DJing is that I look at a record and I instinctively know which one goes with what. And I instinctively, after hearing a record, I know if it's going to mix in with other things, and I can hear when things are blending and in tune, and when the frequencies are hitting in a kind of making music, so you can't have a snare sound that's 1/4 of a tone out playing with the bass sound, because it will sound odd. If you have to make it work, so the snare has to hit a 1/5 higher than the bass sound, and all these things. The kick and snare always have to be in sync with each other for it to sound good.
And it's very similar to kind of programming as well, actually, when you're reading music and you're doing sight reading or you're doing it kind of live, because you visualize the results in your head. And I guess that was very similar to making music on a computer as well back then.
Yeah, doing it on Med, because I used Med originally, on the Amiga, was you have something in your mind which is like a drum roll or a drum pattern. I know that's going to be in a group of 16 or 12, and where the notes will hit. So that's very easy for me to just program into Med, because you visualize it in your mind. Most musicians have the melody in their head and then they have to play it on a keyboard first, and then it goes into the MIDI recorder. With me, I'll be honest, I still don't have a keyboard set up. I never use the keyboard. I have the melody in my mind and I just program it straight in.
Well, going back a bit, before that, your dad was actually a university professor. I mean, did he have access to university systems and use any computers at his work?
Yeah, I first programmed a North Star Horizon terminal. I can't remember what, I think it was Pascal or maybe C was the language that I learned. And it was a PDB 1134. This thing was the size of a kitchen. It was huge, this computer. And there was a guy, it was all done in Unix. And there was one guy that used to just love the computer. And he knew Kevin, this guy's name was, and he was there 24 hours a day working for the University of London.
So were they like kind of terminals that were then hooked up to the main system?
Yes. Yeah. And then about maybe many years later, I remember the internet starting when I was at university, communicating with other people in different universities around the world.
And like, what age were you when you were using that? Because they're pretty expensive pieces of kit. And you must have been like really, really young using that.
I was going there with my dad. He ran the department, and so I could just go along with him on a Friday night. My parents got divorced, so I would spend the weekend with my dad, and I would just go in there with him on a Friday night and use his computers. I think I was 10 at the time.
So you got an Apple II clone. Ravi's wrote down it was an ITT2020, which I must admit I've never heard of that clone system. What's kind of the background to that then, and how did you get that?
It wasn't mine. It was the school's. The school had one computer, and that was it. And there were nerds like me who queued up after school from 4 o'clock onwards to program on it. And this was all in BASIC.
And what year was this around? Because I know, like, educationally, there wasn't that many Apples in the UK. So this must have been kind of a unique thing, having, well, at least a clone there.
77, 78.
And were you using CP/M on there as well?
No. With an ITT 2020, you could... the operating system allowed you to have a basic program in all the time, and you could kind of use that. I bought my own floppy disk that had my own program, so I would take my disk into school and then load up my program, change it around, and then save it, and then take a printout and then stare at the printout until the following day, where hopefully I'll try and get 10 minutes of time to change the program.
And could you actually look at that at home then and kind of figure out if things were going wrong and how they're going to work without having access to the machine?
Yeah. I mean, all programming really is done away from the computer. It's only the kind of input of it and the running of it, which is done on the terminal. Yeah, I mean, I've always been like that. I mean, I remember when I was doing my project at university, still doing a printout, and the printout just got longer and longer and longer. I think the longest program I did, I thought it was ridiculous, 70 feet long. I think this printout was. Yeah.
So my mum she was a mainframe programmer in the 70s.
Oh, wow.
And
okay.
Yeah, when she tried to, I've always been dreadful at programming, but when, she tried to teach me as a kid, she'd always say, do it on a notepad first, and the last thing you should do is input it into the computer after you've worked it out on paper. Yeah,
that's pretty much it. Yeah, I'll still do that now.
Well, obviously then we had, the microcomputer revolution was kind of in full swing when we got into the early 80s, and you upgraded to a Commodore 64, and obviously in terms of machines that could make music, I mean, the 64, the SID chip in that, just a legendary machine. So did you kind of discover the Commodore 64 music after you had it, or was that a reason that you wanted that machine?
No, Commodore 64 for me was just all about gaming. Before that, it was a VIC-20. I didn't have the VIC-20. My friend had the VIC-20. And I think there was a Sinclair. There was a Spectrum around at the time as well. But the one that I honed in on and wanted was the C64. I just thought it was the best one. Most people at the time thought it was the best one. I mean, Commodore were leading the pack at the time.
Well, you wanted to kind of follow in your father's footsteps, so you went to university for computer science.
Yeah.
What was your kind of career plan and path back then?
Well, I didn't really have one. It was just the done thing was go to university and at the end of that, see what was going on. But I was class of 1990, and that was a big recession. When I finished university, there was a recession. I did get an interview and an offer to leave London and go to Basingstoke to work for this little company that I said no to called Microsoft.
Wow.
I know, right? And then I became an insurance salesman, and in my spare time decided to make music on the Amiga, literally to bump up my mixtapes.
I mean, tell us about that job offer at Microsoft then. What was the offer, and why did you turn it down?
I didn't want to leave London. I didn't want to go to Basingstoke. It was working in a small team, in a small office. I think there was about kind of 10 people in this team. And I was going to be just kind of just programming and helping with everything.
So you see, me and Dan are too young to kind of remember the full rave revolution. What was it like when it started kicking off? Because you were at uni at the time, weren't you? It must have been mental.
I was right thick in the middle of it. I mean, when it kicked off, it was end of 87, 88. And then in 88 early 88 was when I got involved and started going to the acid house parties in London. When I went back to university, there was nothing going on at all. But I had these records, and then I met this other guy called Adam who knew what acid house was. And we kind of like formed a relationship. He seemed to have a load of records that I didn't have. I had a load of records he didn't have. And, together we had about 4 or 5 inches worth of records, which wasn't much, but it was enough to put on our first night, acid party night, that we called Aphrodite.
And the raves, when they started in London, didn't they? And then they kind of spread out to these huge outdoor events. Did you get to go to any of those big, massive illegal raves?
Yes. Yeah, I went to quite a few of them. I do remember one, I can't remember what it was called, but I do remember one in 1990 where there was a huge blockade by the police at the gates. And then I remember being at the very front of this, of the ravers, and then we heard the bass drum just going boom, boom in the distance. And all of us, we were so crazed to go to the party. We said, we've got to get through, break down the gates, push the police aside. And we did. We broke down the gate, pushed the police aside, and ran down the hill, several hundred of us, to the party. Quite bonkers when you think about it now, but at the time it was like, that was all we wanted to do. And
it was all kind of before social media as well, wasn't it? So it was like ringing a phone box and just getting the address and then waiting at those service stations as well.
They were the big ones. But to be honest with you, most of the best nights were still going on in club scenes. You had Land of Oz and Spectrum, and that was all going on in Heaven nightclub in London. And that was at a time where the rave scene wasn't big enough to fill the whole club. So it only filled the ground floor, and the top floor was still kind of a bunch of like weird, gay, come God knows what. As ravers, we didn't go up there.
And like guys like Danny Rampling as well was setting up kind of club nights as well. And what were the kind of setups that you had? Like, was it just a real simple 2 decks and a mixer kind of setup, or did you have any effects over the top or anything? Just
2 decks and a mixer, really.
Proper old school stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I've got 2 decks and a mixer over there.
Yeah, I've had my Technics 1210s for about 20 years, and I think they've been taken to more clubs and bars and dropped downstairs, but still work flawlessly.
Yeah, that's where I draw the line, because my first ones were kind of like traveling everywhere. These ones I have now, I wouldn't take them anywhere.
Look after them these days.
Yeah.
And was that quite an investment, like getting the DJ equipment and stuff, and like all the lasers and the light shows? Like,
didn't really need to get all of it. I mean, normally the profits of the party, you managed to get more records and more, maybe some equipment like a smoke generator or something like that. But most of the time, the system, you would use the club system. So I rented clubs out. I wasn't doing things in, those big tents in fields.
Well, let's get on to your work on the Amiga, which is, I mentioned before, I remember reading about what you were doing in Amiga format when I was a kid and being blown away. I mean, when did you first hear that Amiga sound then, and what about it appealed to you?
Well, it was at university. It was in I think end of 89 or beginning of 90. And I walked into a friend of mine's room on campus, just about some work or something like that, or a lecture, and he had one, and I said, "Oh, let's have a look." And then at some point he played a piece of music that I recognised. It was a breakbeat. It just sounded like a normal piece of music, and I said, "What is that? What is that? You've got to show me how to do it." And as soon as I could, I saved up a few months, bought the Amiga, and then sussed out how to do it. And then at the end of that year, I instigated 4 of us who all had Amigas to make a record. And we stayed behind after one of the terms, and we spent a week in a cellar making this record. I called it Cellar 4 because there were 4 of us in a cellar. Needless to say, it totally bombed, didn't do very well at all. And I remember about 10 years ago moving house, I threw about 100 of them into a skip. I did keep some back. Unfortunately, I did, because they sell for quite a lot of money now on Discogs.
And were you aware of stuff like the demo scene and the crack scene? And because I remember a lot of the demo tunes had early like breakbeats in them and stuff.
Yes, I did, but most of what was going on, what I heard from the Amiga scene, I thought was pretty poor. It wasn't up to scratch. It wasn't quality enough. But what I thought was that with a bit of time, patience, and work, you could get it sounding good. So you could, if you operated on the sounds and then clean them up with the mixer, etc., making sure there's no silence, no hiss. You have to do so much operations on the samples. If you can get that sounding good, then what you play will be relatively clear.
And I think you're right there, because, I mean, I was mentioning this in the first part of our show today, that, when I was at school, we had like a group of us that were into video games, and a few of the older kids who were like, they were going to the raves and everything, and they kind of looked down on us for being a bit nerdy and kiddie. And then I remember saying to one of them, the music you listen to, a lot of that's made on the Amiga. And he's like, get out of here. No, it's not. You're lying. And he didn't believe that it could make music like, you guys were making. I mean, what was kind of the mastering process that you used? Because it did sound so much better than what you heard on games.
Well, for a start, you have to have 2 computers working together, because you've only got 2 channels coming out the back of the computer, and out of each of those channels, you can mix 2 things in. So you can only play 4 things at the same time. So the 2 things that are playing at the same time, you generally want to be that same part of the music. For example, if you've got a breakbeat and a hi-hat, you can put them on one channel. If you've got a kick drum, you can probably put that with the snare. The bass, because it's low and gritty, keep that on its own. Then suddenly what you have to realize is you haven't got enough channels on one computer to make a record. You need 2 or even 3. That's why we had 4 of them linked up down in the cellar. And we figured out when we were in that cellar that the best way of keeping them in time was with a click track. You could once you press play, you could speed up and slow down. But if you had a click, like a metronome going on at the same time, once it was in sync, in flanging, you knew that the 2 Amigas were in sync. Then the track could be played.
And were they like literally Amiga 500s? And was it just a case of listening to the click track and then hitting spacebar at the right time?
Yeah. I mean, for example, at the beginning of your track, I have 4 blocks of clicks and then 1 block of silence. The other Amiga will have 3 blocks of clicks and 1 block of silence. So he gets his mouse ready at the end of my first block, and then plays his one, and then will speed up and slow down to get the click in sync, so that so it's flanging really tightly through the speakers. We did that with actually 4 computers, but because there was too many things playing at the same time, it got a bit messy. It always sounded better the less tracks you had playing, because less is more with music production.
Yeah, and I think there might be a tendency for a lot of, especially new producers, to just kind of throw everything in there and try and overcomplicate things. Yeah,
absolutely. Since I've gone from Amiga to Logic, I'm guilty of the same thing myself.
Well, talk us through a bit about that kind of Amiga setup that you had then. You had the 4 Amiga 500s then. I mean, did you have samplers? What kind of things were you running these through?
No. For the very first one in 1990, there was just 4 Amigas. That was it. We did have a guitar on one of them, but when we went to 2 Amigas, say the first single, "Some Justice," that was literally just 2 Amigas. And how we mixed that down was it went into a standard Newmark mixer, DJ mixer with 4 channels. We got the balance as best we could and the EQ as best we could from the samples and from the Amiga. And then it went into the DJ mixer. There was a little bit of Aural Exciter, and then it went straight onto the DAC.
Wow. So it was like directly mastering off kind of live playing.
Yes.
And what tracker software were you using? Were you a Pro Tracker or an Octamed guy?
We always used Octamed. I think we used Octamed 3. 2 was around for a little bit, but they changed to 3. 3 was pretty good. I think we used that for a while. And then 4 was the best one. 5 I didn't enjoy. 6 I didn't enjoy. So I stayed with 4, I think.
And did that have any MIDI options as well? Did you have any MIDI controllers in there? Or...
Yeah, you had full MIDI capabilities. So I used to run later on in the 90s, in the mid-90s, for about 95, I think I bought my Akai S3000i and then used that. There was other things. I got another couple of modules as well, but I didn't use them very much. I favoured the sampling nature of the S3000.
What kind of made that Amiga sound so unique, especially in regards to the bass?
If you look at the waveform of an Amiga bass, it is flat and big, and it does not change. There is no ADSR. There is no up and down in volume at all. It is just big and solid and constant. And when you're cutting that onto a piece of vinyl, you basically cut the bass at its maximum speed, at its maximum volume. If you have a volume that comes out of a synthesizer, a bass that comes out of a synthesizer, there's always some sort of ADSR. So even with a long bass, you'll have this kind of hit at the front. So the volume of the waveform goes large at the beginning. Now, when you're cutting bass to vinyl, you can only cut to a maximum volume. So what it means is that your Amiga bass will be louder and bigger once it goes to vinyl. Whereas your keyboard bass, whatever keyboard it is, will never be as big and loud sounding as the one that comes straight out of the Amiga.
And in those raves, it was a kind of competition to get the big bass lines and get the crowd going. So that was pretty much ideal for that.
It was. I mean, to have your vinyl as a loud pressing as possible. I mean, it did get a bit silly in the end. And I know the Jump Up crew, the Jump Up Jungle crew, or Jump Up Drum and Bass crew, still to this day have this obsession with loudness. But it's not so relevant anymore because you can, with gain and volume, you can always change things.
Well, how did you and Mickey Finn get together, and where did Some Justice come from?
I made 2 tracks to bump up my mixtape, and I thought these sounded pretty good. I made 2 of them in one night, and one of them was the early mix of Some Justice. It had the fatback horn sampled at the beginning, and the bass line with the kind of up and down and the wobbleness of the bass line. And I played them in a record shop to Ray Keith, of all people. And he was in the record shop and he said, "Yeah, this sounds great." Also in the record shop was Mickey, and he said, "Oh, this sounds great." So he came round, and then he was an ideas man. He said, like, "How about this break?" And then I pulled out one of my favourite records, which was CeCe Rogers' "Someday," where there's this big vocal on the other side. He said, "Sample it." He said, "We can't sample that. That's CeCe Rogers. You can't." And we did. It worked. and then we were able to clear the sample with CC Rogers, and the track went out, and it went big, it went massive in the UK.
That must have been crazy suddenly being like, not that you were typical pop stars, but having a track in the charts technically made you a pop star.
Yeah, I mean, it was great. We did a second one, and then we did more. And then at the time, the music was changing so fast that the music from 1991 was completely different to 92, 93, then 94, Jungle came along. Before that, pretty much everyone was playing the same. If you looked at all the rave DJs in 1990, pretty much everyone was playing the same kind of stuff. It was only by 92, 93 where you had these people splitting into house, trance, jungle, breakbeat, and all the different variants.
Did you ever end up taking Amigas into nightclubs, or was it purely just for the kind of mastering? You wouldn't do any live playing?
No. We did think about it, but there were too many things that could have gone wrong, so it just wasn't on our agenda in the end.
You know, he had that top 40 hit with Some Justice. I mean, I always remember seeing when you'd see like DJs and dance music acts on Top of the Pops, and you'd always have like a guy in the background, pretending to mix on the Technics 1210s, that kind of thing. Yes. I mean, did you ever get asked to do any of that kind of thing?
I did. I was asked to go on Top of the Pops with the Jungle Brothers remix that we did. I think I can't remember what number it got to, number 26 maybe. But I wasn't able to make it. For whatever reason at the time, life got pretty busy in the late 90s for me. I think I was off DJing somewhere, but they did do it, and I don't know, they probably just paid someone to just sit there and mime with a keyboard, I think.
Oh, wicked, because that got quite big as well. I remember it was used in a movie, actually.
Yeah, everything was done on the Amiga. However, the True Blue remix was, the sounds came out of the Akai, but I used Med for the notations. So as far as the actual sound coming out of the Amiga, 1995, I think APH 17 and 18. So about 1995 was when I kind of transferred everything to Akai. And got it sounding right coming out the Akai. Whereas there was a period of time, only a few months, where the sounds would come out the Akai and the bass and beats would come out of the Amiga.
Well, you did feature in that Amiga format issue that I mentioned before in 1992, and you're actually the cover stars, the cover lead on that issue.
Yes.
How did that come about then? Did they kind of approach you, and how did the Amiga community kind of embrace you then?
I can't remember how. There was a guy called, was it Tony Horgan?
Yes, we've had him on the podcast, actually.
I think it was him. I remember getting in touch with him. I think it was to do with Med, because there was a few changes and things I wanted done with Med. So I ended up talking to the Med guys. Is it Tinjay Hinneman?
Yeah, I can never say his name either, but I know who you mean. Yeah,
Finland, didn't he?
I've got his name on. I've actually got the Optimed manual here. It's like Tinja. Yeah, I can never say it.
I can't remember, but yeah. I mean, I remember getting in touch with him and then asking him if he could make it do this, that, and the other, because he was very techie rather than musical.
Which other DJs and producers were using the Amiga at the time? I remember DJ Zinc was one. Paradox. Did you guys meet up at all and chat about using the Amiga and share tips? Yeah,
I didn't know Zinc was I thought he was one of the Atari crew. Most people were using Ataris and Cubase. I know that Foul Play, their music sounded like it was Amigas, and then I got to know Busy Bee at some point in the 94, 95, something like that. And I do remember him phoning me up, and somewhere I've got this recording of him leaving a message saying, "The tracks you are coming out with are blowing my mind," which I always remember, because I really got heavy into chopping up and messing around with breakbeats. And there was one particular record I did called Booyah, Beat Booyah. And I'm pretty sure that I did as much as is humanly possible to the Amen break as anyone could ever do.
Was there much of a rivalry as well between the Amiga producers and the Atari guys?
No, but if you analyse one of the tracks, you could tell it was made by an Amiga. But I think no, there was just a common ground. It didn't really matter how your music was made. It was more how it sounded at the end. It was kind of irrelevant how it was made, because I was living proof that you could make a record, a good sounding record for £1,000 worth of equipment, as you can a good sounding record with a £500,000 studio.
And I think you're right, because that era did kind of change that quite a lot, didn't it? 'Cause I remember the song White Town, Your Woman, that was like a UK number one. And I remember, them doing like news reports on how it was like some teenage kid in his bedroom using an Atari ST. And the fact that then it was possible to compete in the charts with these people who were using £1 million studios.
Yeah, that's right. Because at the end of the day, all you're doing is creating a waveform. And if you can work out a way of doing that waveform cheaper, then do it.
And you also released a Urban Shakedown sample pack, which is quite sought after now. Everybody's like, oh, get that Urban Shakedown sample pack. What's the story behind that?
Well, people, I don't think people generally, one of the common mistakes I used to hear, and I heard it a lot in people's productions, was they would play the sample and then try and clean it up as it was coming through the mixing desk. But the samples, to start with, have to be supremely clean. That you have to operate on the samples before it even comes comes out of the sequence. And I think people always underestimate the amount of work that can go in just to getting a hi-hat to sound good before it even goes in the sequencer. And I had a lot of sounds and things that we were using, and I can't remember who it was. I think someone suggested the sample. It might have even been Tony Horgan himself suggesting it. And then it went out on Amiga format. And
it was really good, actually, because, you had those old sample packs like STO1, STO2, and I think it went up to 99. But to have a different set with some breakbeats and stuff was really useful.
There was a lot of classic beats that people were using, but a lot of them, like what I know as the helicopter beat, there was a kind of glitch on the original, and everyone seemed to sample the original, and there was this glitch in it forevermore. And this used to wind the hell out of me. And, it would do my brain in every time I heard it. And so I made my own version of that track and that breakbeat. But in order to do that, it's not just a case of breaking it down into kick, snare, and hi-hat. For example, the snare and the shaker sound, for example, there might be a bit of vocal or a bit of glitch on the original, so I have to take that out and replace it with some of the noise from somewhere else in that breakbeat in it. And so the snare that I finally am left with might not actually be anything related to the snare at all. I might have made some reverb, added the reverb, reversed it for a little bit, then mixed it in slightly, and then put a small volume descent in it, and then made the end make sure the sample always starts and ends with a 0. All these little things that go in to make the sound. It might not be a sound that's possible to sample. In fact, a lot of the things that I do even now, they're not actual possible to sample. They're kind of sounds that, I like that sound there. And then when you sample it, it's got a bit of vocal on, it's got a bit of this, that, and the other. And then you find the bit that you need to replace it from somewhere else. And so you end up kind of creating a sound that didn't exist in the first place.
Yeah, something totally new from like just from a reference.
Yes, yeah. And then you put it through some of the mad effects that were on were within the Amiga. I remember there was this crazy echo, and you could echo things very tightly to make a note, and it made it sound a flange effect. And I used that quite a few times. That was great, because you can't do that on the Atari or that effect anywhere else. And I love the way you could draw your bass sound as well, and that was great.
You know, the stuff that you were doing back then, you know, as a kid in my bedroom with a copy of Pro Tracker, trying to, you know, just make some music on the Amiga, and I was terrible at it, you know. It still blows my mind, the effects and the things that you came out with, the quality. Have you still got an Amiga set up today then, with any of like your old mods on floppy disk or your sample packs or anything?
Yes, I have the Amiga set up right next to me. I have my box of discs, well, one of them, right behind me. And I re-released a record recently that was 100% done on the Amiga. The sounds that came out of the Amiga, it was a track called A-Zone, Calling the People. And I did it in 1994. And it became a big jungle tune. And I just got all the sounds. I found the sounds. I had to ring Busy Bee up, actually, for some Amiga help, because he's much more techie than me. I can't remember what it was to do with, some sort of glitch on one of the discs, maybe. I can't rightly remember, but I got it, and then I played it into the Apple that I'm using now, into Logic, and then once I had everything in Logic, I then mixed it down again to get it sounding kind of crisp and more now-like. But you do that, and it still sounds like the original. And then people who listen to it go, it sounds awesome. It sounds just like the original. It sounds brilliant. They don't actually realise that you've spent a lot of time cleaning it up, because they're so used to modern production techniques. All it does, it just sounds crisp, but they actually think the original sounded crisp, and it really wasn't at all. The original was proper messy.
You know what, though, if you listen to a lot of like young producers now who kind of, you know, got like the synthwave genre and all that stuff is becoming big now, and a lot of people are kind of aiming to try and recapture that, you know, the early 90s kind of chip tune and like the Amiga and the Commodore 64, that kind of sound. But I think you can always tell when it's real hardware.
Possibly, yes, possibly. I think a lot of it comes down to how it's mixed down in the end, because my early tracks had a certain flavour to them, because I was using an analog mixing desk. It was just a Spirit, a very cheap one, but I could redline things, and I could put analog distortion in there and do all sorts of things in that, and that had its own sound. I then went to a Mackie 32, and that again had its own sound, but you couldn't distort things because that was a digital mixer. And now you have the other thing again, which is everything is inside the computer, and you're mixing it down inside the computer. And in some ways, the computer blends everything together a bit too much, so it sounds a little overproduced. Whereas, you know, just a snare, kick drum, and a hi-hat can sound amazing if it comes out of an old mixing desk.
And I think there's been a movement towards that recently. I know, like, Ravi was telling me the Chemical Brothers, their last album, that, you know, they went back to using individual hardware devices rather than doing it all on a computer.
Yeah. You actually have to work harder on your sounds to get them sounding full. If you're working within Logic, it's difficult to know, to put your finger on why.
So I know obviously the music industry has been really a different place over the last year, obviously with venues not being open and not being able to perform. I mean, how's kind of life for you at the moment then? What are you up to these days, and what's kind of your plan for 2021?
Well, you know, I became a DJ for many, many years, and then now I've become this legendary DJ. I think once you reach a certain age, you become legend. That's quite cool because I still can DJ everywhere. But during the pandemic, I haven't really been doing any of that at all. So I have been doing bits and pieces with releases. I've done a few tunes, not as many as I should have done. I'm not as prolific as I was back in the day because I like to sleep these days.
Well, Gavin, it's been wonderful catching up with you. Thank you so much for sharing your stories and that little insight into your time using the Amiga. I think it's amazing you've got an Amiga set up again, and hopefully we can hear more stuff that you've made on that platform at some point in the future.
Well, you can see the Amiga set up. I can take a picture of it, but there was a BBC documentary I was in recently where they came to the studio and filmed me in here, and there's a clip of that somewhere.
Oh, fantastic. Well, if I track that down on YouTube or something, I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, someone's put it on there. Urban Shakedown, Aphrodite with his Amiga.
Great. All right, well, I'll link that up. Everyone can check that out as well. So, fantastic. Well, listen, thank you so much for coming on and being our guest this week. Really enjoyed talking to you.
No problem. Thank you.